Have you ever had that feeling that you're not alone in your own home? That late-night creak from the floorboards upstairs? The shadow you thought you saw in the corner of your eye? Most of the time, of course, it's nothing. The house settling, your mind playing tricks on you. But what if it wasn't? Imagine this. You live on an isolated farm miles away from your nearest neighbor. It's the dead of winter, and fresh snow has blanketed everything, creating a perfect, untouched canvas. One morning, you step outside and see a single set of footprints in the snow. They lead out of the dark woods, across your property, and right up to your house. But there are no footprints leading away. Someone or something walked up to your home and never left. You search the house, the attic, even the barn, and you find nothing. But for the next few days, you keep hearing strange things. Whispers from the attic, keys going missing. You can't shake the feeling that you are consistently being watched, that you are no longer alone, and your home is no longer safe. This isn't the opening to a horror film. This was the chilling reality for a family in rural Germany in 1922, just before they were all brutally murdered. The footprints were just the beginning of one of the most terrifying and baffling unsolved cases in European history. Welcome to Timorus, a podcast dedicated to chilling disappearances and horrific true crimes. Today, we're talking about the Hinterkaifeck Murders. Our story takes place on a small, remote farmstead known as Hinterkaifeck, tucked away in the dense forests near the Bavarian town of Weidhofen, Germany. The name itself, Hinterkaifeck, basically means behind Kaifeck, highlighting its immense isolation. It was nearly a kilometer away from the nearest village, nestled deep within the woods. This was not a place you simply stumbled upon. You had to know it was there, and seek it out. It was in the spring of 1922 that this isolation would become a tomb. Living on the farm was the Gruber family. The patriarch was 63-year-old Andreas Gruber. By most accounts, Andreas was not a well-liked man. He was known to be cantankerous, abusive, and generally disliked by his neighbors. He lived with his 72-year-old wife, Cecilia. She was described as devotedly religious, but lived under the thumb of her domineering husband. Living with them was their 35-year-old widowed daughter, Victoria Gabriel. Her husband, Karl Gabriel, had reportedly been killed in the trenches of World War I years earlier, leaving her to raise their 7-year-old daughter, also named Cecilia. Victoria also had another child, a 2-year-old boy named Joseph. The identity of Joseph's father was a subject of dark local gossip. While Victoria had been involved with a local man, Lorenz Schlittenbauer, it was widely and darkly rumored that the true father was her own father, Andreas. This wasn't just idle gossip either. Andreas and Victoria had actually been convicted in court for incest years prior. So you can imagine the tension and the secrets swirling within the walls of that isolated farmhouse. The final resident was the family's maid, or more accurately, their brand new maid. The previous maid had quit her job 6 months earlier, leaving in a state of pure terror. She claimed the farm was haunted. She insisted that she had heard footsteps and disembodied voices in the attic, and refused to stay another night. For half a year, the Grubers couldn't find anyone willing to take the job, with all the rumors surrounding the family. Finally, though, on March 31st, 1922, a new maid arrived. Her name was Maria Baumgartner, and she was just 44 years old. Her sister had walked her to the farm that afternoon. It was her first day on the job, but tragically, she would be dead within hours. The weeks leading up to the end of March 1922 were filled with a creeping dread. The strange events that the previous maid had described didn't simply stop when she left. Andreas Gruber himself complained to the neighbors about hearing footsteps in the attic directly above his bedroom. He would climb the ladder to check, armed with a pitchfork, but every time he searched, he found no one. The attic was empty. Then, one day, a strange newspaper from Munich appeared on the property. No one in the family had subscribed to it, and no one knew how it got there. A few days after that, one of the main house keys went missing. Andreas searched everywhere, but couldn't find it. The feeling of being violated, of some unseen presence in their lives, was growing day by day. Then came the most unsettling discovery of all: the footsteps in the snow. Andreas told a neighbor that he had found a single track leading from the forest edge directly to the farmhouse's machine room. But there were no tracks leading back out. Whoever had made them was either still on the property, or they had vanished into thin air. He also noted that someone had apparently tried to pick the lock on the machine room door. Despite all of this, however, the noises, the keys, the footprints, Andreas Gruber did not go to the police. Perhaps out of pride, or a stubborn belief that he could handle it himself. Regardless of what motivated this decision, it would prove to be a fatal mistake. The last time anyone saw the family alive was on Friday, March 31st. That was the day Maria Baumgartner, the new maid, arrived. That evening, it is believed the killer or killers finally made their move. The methodical nature of what happened next is part of what makes this case so bone-chilling. The investigators believe the family was lured out to the barn one by one. It was a brutal, systematic execution. First, it seems, was the elder Kalizia, then her husband Andreas, followed by their daughter Victoria, and finally, 7-year-old Kazilia. Each of them was struck down with a mattock, a heavy farming tool similar to a pickaxe. Their bodies were left in the barn, partially covered with hay. The killer or killers then went from the barn into the main house. There they murdered 2-year-old Joseph as he slept in his cot in his mother's bedroom. Finally, they entered the new maid's room and killed Maria Baumgartner in her bed. And then, silence. For the next 4 days, life around Hinterkaifeck went on as usual, but a series of small things began to seem off. Young Kazilia didn't show up for school on Saturday or on Monday. The family, who were regulars at the weekly church service, were absent on Sunday. The postman noticed that the mail he had delivered on Saturday was still sitting where he'd left it on Monday. Nothing was moving around the house. Finally, on Tuesday, April 4th, a mechanic named Albert Hoffner arrived at the farm to repair a small engine. He waited around for an hour, calling the family, but no one answered. He noted the eerie quiet, the stillness of the place, and saw that the barn door was open. He felt incredibly uneasy and left without doing the repair. He mentioned the family's absence to the villagers, and the concern finally reached the tipping point. That afternoon, Lorenz Schlittenbauer, the neighbor who had had an affair with Victoria and claimed to be Joseph's father, organized a small search party. He went to the farm with 2 other men. They circled the property, peering into the windows. What they saw was disturbing enough, but it was nothing compared to what they would find inside. After getting no response from the family, they decided to force their way in, starting with the barn. There, in the dim light, they found them, the bodies of Andreas, Kazelia, Victoria, and young Kazelia, piled together and covered in hay. The scene was a complete bloodbath. Horrified, they backed out and went to the main house. Inside, however, the horror only continued. They found the body of the new maid Maria in her room, and in the bedroom across the hall, the body of little Joseph in his cot. All of them dead from savage blows to the head. The police from Munich were called in, but the investigation was a mess from the very beginning. By the time they arrived, the crime scene had been completely compromised. Neighbors, officials, and curiosity seekers had walked all over the farmstead, touching things, moving things, including the bodies. Lorenz Schlittenbauer himself admitted to moving the victims in the barn, supposedly to look for his son, Joseph. Despite all the chaos, a few key and deeply disturbing facts emerged. The first was that robbery was almost certainly not the motive. A large amount of cash was found untouched inside the house, so whoever did this was evidently not after money. The second, and perhaps the most bizarre detail of all, was the evidence that the killer had remained at the farm after the murders had been committed. For how long exactly? Possibly days. Somebody had continued to feed the cattle and the family dog. Neighbors had reported seeing smoke coming from the chimney across the weekend. Somebody had been eating food from the kitchen too. Think about that for just 1 second. The killer murders 6 people, including 2 small children, in the most brutal way imaginable, and then stays at the scene of their crime. They sleep in the house with the bodies of their victims being just a few feet away. They cook and eat meals. They tend to the farm animals. It's just a level of comfort and familiarity with the surroundings that is deeply terrifying. This wasn't just a panicked crime of passion or a simple robbery gone wrong. This was something else entirely. Something cold, calculated, and very deeply personal. The autopsies conducted by Dr. Johann Baptist Müller confirmed that all 6 victims died from massive blunt force trauma to the head, likely inflicted by the mattock found at the scene. The timing suggested they were killed on Friday evening. Young Kazelia showed signs of having torn her own hair out in terror in her final moments. In a grim and rather ghoulish footnote to the investigation, the bodies were all buried at Weidhoven, but their heads had been removed first. They were sent to Munich for further examination by clairvoyants and psychics, a sign of just how desperate the police were to further the investigation. The skulls, however, were never returned. They were lost during the chaos of World War II and have never been found since. Over the years, the police investigated more than 100 suspects, but no one was ever charged. The case went cold, but never left the public's eye. It became a dark legend, a campfire story rooted in terrifying facts. The mystery of who killed the Gruber family and why has given rise to a number of compelling theories. This brings us to the first major theory, and likely the most cinematic, that the killer was none other than Victoria's husband, Carl Gabriel, returned from the dead. If you remember, Carl Gabriel was officially listed as killed in action in France in 1914, But in the chaos of World War I, records were far from perfect. A body had never been officially recovered. For years after the war, local rumors persisted that Karl hadn't died at all. Several of his fellow soldiers later claimed they were certain he had survived the battle where he was reported to have been killed. Some even claimed that they had met him after the war and that he had expressed a desire to return to Russia. The theory goes that Karl Gabriel didn't die. He was perhaps captured, became a Soviet sympathizer, or simply deserted and built a new life. Then, years later, he decides to return to Hinterkaifeck. What would he find waiting for him there? He'd find his wife, Victoria, having had a child, Joseph, with another man, possibly even her own father. The motive in this case is pure, uncontrollable rage. A jealous husband, driven mad by betrayal and the ultimate family taboo, returns to exact terrible revenge. It would explain the personal, almost overkill nature of the violence. It could also explain why the killer was familiar with the farm's layout and how to manage the animals. After committing the murders, he simply disappears again, melting back into the post-war chaos of Europe. It is undoubtedly a very compelling narrative, the ghost of the past returning to punish the sins of the present. However, the evidence against it is rather strong. The official military record is clear, and although sometimes inaccurate, they seem very certain that Karl Gabriel died in 1914. Several soldiers from his regiment signed affidavits confirming his death. While stories of him being alive certainly circulated, they were never substantiated with proof. It's far more likely that these were simple cases of mistaken identity in the very confusing aftermath of the trauma of war. It's a powerful story, perhaps even movie-worthy, but it probably belongs more to fiction than fact. This leads us to the second and, for many, the most plausible theory. The killer was the neighbor, Lorenz Schlittenbauer. Schlittenbauer is a central figure in this story. He had an affair with Victoria. He was engaged in a legal and financial dispute with Andreas Gruber over whether or not he was Joseph's father. He desperately wanted to marry Victoria, but the domineering Andreas stood in his way. So, right off the bat, you have a motive. Get rid of Andreas, claim Victoria and even the farm for himself. But it's his behavior after the murders that really puts him under the microscope. Remember, he's the one who led the initial search party. He was the first to enter the barn, and he admitted to moving the bodies. Why? He claimed he was looking for his son, but it's a very strange thing to do at a crime scene. Did he contaminate the scene of his own crime on purpose? Was he looking for something, or perhaps planting or hiding something? Furthermore, his knowledge of the farm was incredibly intimate. He would have known the layout perfectly. He would have known where the tools were kept. He knew the family's routine, even where they may have placed their keys. He knew how to care for the cattle, and he fits the profile of someone who could stay on the farm for a few days without arousing external suspicion. Years later, long after the official investigation had closed, people close to Schlittenbauer came forward with some disturbing stories. A local teacher claimed that Schlittenbauer, late in his life and near death in 1941, had confessed to the crime on his deathbed at a local hospital, although this is unconfirmed. Another story suggests he showed a local priest the bloody mattock hidden in his attic. But there were problems with this theory as well. Schlittenbauer was, of course, a primary suspect from the very beginning. He was interrogated extensively by police, but they could never find enough evidence to charge him. He had friends who provided him with a concrete alibi, claiming he was with them on the night of the murders. And if his goal was to marry Victoria, why on earth would he kill her? And why kill the children, especially Joseph, who he claimed was his own son, and was in an intense legal dispute over? Why murder the maid who had only been there for a few short hours, especially if she was in her room, unaware of what was happening outside? The sheer scope of the massacre seems to go beyond his proposed motive, which in the first place seems rather flimsy. While his actions were no doubt suspicious, suspicion itself is not evidence. He lived out the rest of his life in the same village that the crime took place, a man forever tainted by the shadow of Hinterkaifeck. Another possibility, and one that the police initially considered, is that it was a drifter or a botched robbery. The theory goes that a vagrant or a small-time criminal passing through the area saw the isolated farm as an easy target. Perhaps they were hiding out in the woods, which would explain the footprints. They were watching the farm, which would explain the noises in the attic and missing keys. Maybe they were just casing the place and planning to rob it, but Andreas Gruber caught them in the act. A struggle ensued and the robber panicked, killing Andreas. To eliminate all the witnesses, they then proceeded to kill everyone else on the farm. The evidence that the killer stayed for a few days could support this theory. A homeless person or somebody on the run would have a warm place to stay and food to eat for a short while. It could serve as a temporary haven. This theory accounts for the pre-crime oddities better than some of the others. However, the biggest piece of evidence against this theory is the fact that nothing of value was taken. The large sum of cash was left behind. Most robberies, even ones that go horribly wrong, are still about the money. On top of this, the systematic alluring of the family members into the barn one by one doesn't feel at all like a panicked reaction. Instead, it feels planned. The level of brutality directed at the entire family, including a 2-year-old child, seems to point away from a simple thief and towards a killer with a deep-seated rage. Finally, there's a more obscure theory that only emerged in the late 1990s. It involves 2 brothers, Adolf and Anton Gump, who were connected to a large criminal figure in the area. This theory stems from a deathbed confession. In 1999, a woman named Crescentia Rieger claimed that her brothers, Adolf and Anton, were the murderers. She said they had confessed their involvement to her years before. According to her story, they went to Hinterkaifeck to rob the family, as Andreas Gruber was rumored to have a stash of money from some illicit dealings. The robbery went wrong quickly, and so they killed everyone. This story gained a fair bit of traction because, funnily enough, a psychic involved in the case back in the 1920s had mentioned the name Gump as being significant. The brothers were, of course, investigated following this new lead, but again, nothing conclusive could be found. The story rests entirely on the word of one dying woman, recounting something she was allegedly told decades earlier. With the brothers long dead by this point, there was absolutely no way to verify her claims. It's another teasing thread in a tapestry of dead ends. So, where exactly does that leave us? It leaves us right back where we started. In the dark, on an isolated farm with 6 bodies and no answers. The farmstead of Hinterkaifeck was demolished just a year after the murders in 1923. They tore it all down, board by board, trying to erase the terrible stain on the landscape. But a story like this isn't one you can simply forget. Today, nothing remains but a small memorial shrine, a cross in the woods where the house once stood. The true horror of Hinterkaifeck isn't just in the brutality of the act itself. It's the prelude, the build-up. It's in the slow, creeping dread of those final few days. The feeling of being watched, the certainty that an intruder was somewhere on their property, and the terrifying knowledge that they were completely alone, cut off from any form of help. The killer in this case was not just a murderer. They were a haunting ghost in the house, terrifying its maid before they ever picked up a weapon and struck to kill. Whoever it was, they knew the farm. They certainly knew the family. They likely lured Andreas, Victoria, and the others into the barn under some form of false pretense. Perhaps a noise from their cattle, or a problem that needed to be fixed urgently. They exploited the family's trust and their daily routine to lead them to their deaths. And after their slaughter, they made the house their own. They ate their food, slept in their bed, all while the victims lay cold in the barn and in their rooms. Then, after several days, the killer simply walked away, melting back into the world and taking the secrets of what happened on that bloody Friday night with them forever. Thank you for listening. I hope you have enjoyed this episode of Timorus. It's stories like these that stick with you, the ones where the edges are blurred and the answers remain eternally out of reach. If there are any cases you would like for me to cover, please feel free to get in contact through our comments section or send us a message through our Spotify page. Thank you once again for listening. And remember, there are some things far more frightening than death.